What if I told you a country once known for drought is now rewriting Africa's future with nothing but drill rigs and determination? Deep beneath the dry soil of Burkina Faso, a silent revolution is happening. Villages that once walked miles for water are now striking life straight from the earth. This isn't just about boreholes, it's about power, independence, and the future of Africa. Stay with me, because this changes everything.
The first sound was not an explosion, not a protest, not a government announcement. It was the low, steady hum of a drilling machine cutting through dry earth in the outskirts of Burkina Faso. It was a sound that most of the world would never hear, yet it marked the beginning of one of the most powerful silent revolutions in modern African history. While global powers argued over oil pipelines and shipping routes, Burkina Faso was quietly drilling something far more valuable than gold. It was drilling life. For generations, water had defined the limits of survival across the Sahel. Women walked miles under blistering sunlight, carrying containers heavier than their own bodies. Children missed school to help search for muddy streams. Farmers stared at cracked soil that had once fed entire communities. Burkina Faso had become a symbol of scarcity to outsiders and a symbol of endurance to those who lived there. Yet beneath that dry land lay hidden rivers, ancient underground reservoirs, forgotten lifelines buried deep in the earth. For decades, these water reserves remained untouched because of lack of technology, lack of investment, and lack of political will. The world had told Burkina Faso that it should focus on aid dependency, not engineering miracles. Burkina Faso chose a different path. The borehole water revolution did not begin in a palace or ministry. It began in a small technical workshop where young Burkinabe engineers trained in local universities and refined through partnerships with African and Asian institutions began to question a simple idea. Why should water be imported as a solution when it existed naturally below their own feet? In Ouagadougou, quiet planning sessions turned into coordinated national strategy. Rather than waiting for international donors, Burkina Faso redirected internal funds, partnered with regional experts, and built a new generation of drilling rigs designed for African terrain. These were not borrowed machines. These were not second-hand tools from old industries. These were African-built, African-maintained, and African-operated machines. The first successful deep borehole project changed everything. A village that had depended on seasonal rainwater for centuries suddenly had a permanent water source. Crops that had failed year after year began to grow again. Livestock returned. Migration slowed. That single borehole became proof that scarcity was not destiny. News traveled fast across the countryside, but slowly across the world. Neighboring Mali took notice. Communities along the Burkina Faso-Mali border began to share techniques. Local technicians crossed invisible lines drawn by colonial maps and began to build water systems together. In Niger, engineers studied the drilling depths achieved by Burkina Faso and adapted them to their own soil. Ghana sent observers. Nigeria sent questions. Ethiopia sent curiosity. What looked like a water project was gradually becoming a geopolitical transformation. Burkina Faso realized that control of water meant control of stability. In a region where conflicts were often fueled by resource scarcity, water was currency, peace, and power. Instead of fighting wars over rivers, Burkina Faso was creating rivers underground. The African Union began to quietly observe. Internal reports showed something unusual. Areas with new boreholes had reduced conflict, improved education attendance, increased agricultural output, and higher local economic activity. Water was not just hydrating bodies. It was reorganizing society. As drilling expanded, factories began to emerge in Burkina Faso that manufactured piping, filtration systems, hand pumps, and solar-powered pumping stations. Rather than importing solutions, Burkina Faso exported them. Trucks rolled from Ouagadougou into Niger loaded with locally manufactured water systems. Engineers from Senegal visited to study the frameworks. Delegations from Kenya exchanged technical data. The Pan-Africanism that many leaders once spoke about in speeches was now flowing through pipes beneath the soil. This was no longer just Burkina Faso's project. It became Africa's blueprint. China noticed. China had spent decades studying water management, groundwater extraction, and desert agriculture techniques. Instead of arriving as a master, China arrived as a student and a collaborator. Chinese engineers didn't replace Burkinabe ones. They sat beside them. They shared stabilizing techniques, drilling durability methods, and digital mapping systems. Technology flowed both ways. Unlike past partnerships, Burkina Faso controlled the terms. Water belonged to Africa first. China accepted that. That acceptance changed trust. New research centers opened in Burkina Faso with Chinese and African co-investment. These centers trained engineers not just from Burkina Faso, but from Chad, Nigeria, Sudan, and Tanzania. Knowledge stopped traveling through Western capitals and started traveling through African corridors. Western powers were slow to react. At first, they dismissed the project as small-scale humanitarian development. Later, they realized that water independence could destabilize their traditional influence systems. Water had always been a leverage point. When you controlled water access, you controlled agreements, aid, and dependence. Burkina Faso was removing that control. Diplomatic pressure began quietly. Development agencies offered funding, but with oversight conditions. Burkina Faso declined or renegotiated. Think tanks wrote reports warning about resource nationalism. Burkina Faso responded with silence and drilling. More boreholes appeared. Farms transformed into green corridors across areas once considered barren. Local textile industries began emerging again because cotton fields regained productivity. Food security improved. Health improved. Schools expanded. Markets grew. The water did not just feed crops. It fed confidence. In Nigeria, policymakers noticed the psychological shift. Burkina Faso was no longer seen as a fragile Sahelian state. It was becoming a model. Nigerian engineers partnered with Burkinabe drilling teams to bring similar projects to semi-arid northern regions. Ghana began experimental deep-water recovery projects inspired by Burkina Faso's approach. Sudan sent a delegation. Ethiopia sent a team. Kenya sent students. The Drill for Life initiative became the quiet infrastructure of a new African renaissance. Underground, water flowed. Above ground, power shifted. Then came the moment when the world could no longer ignore it. A prolonged drought struck parts of North Africa and Southern Europe. Water shortages disrupted agriculture, energy production, and even urban supplies. While countries with advanced economies struggled, satellite images showed something unexpected: green expansion zones across Burkina Faso, agricultural output rising, exports stabilizing. The world began asking questions. How was a landlocked Sahel nation thriving while coastal industrial power struggled? The answer was simple and dangerous. Burkina Faso had mastered its underground sovereignty. At an African Economic Summit hosted in Addis Ababa, Burkina Faso presented its water sovereignty doctrine. It stated clearly that access to water was a national security asset, not a donation-driven resource. Borehole development was listed alongside energy and defense as strategic infrastructure. Many African countries signed on. The Water Alliance spread. Niger began large-scale drilling. Mali expanded systems. Chad mapped aquifers. Nigeria integrated water corridors into its long-term agricultural strategy. South Sudan adopted small-scale mobile drilling units inspired by Burkina Faso. Soon, corridors of underground water infrastructure connected regions that once relied entirely on unstable rivers and seasonal rainfall. The idea of Pan-Africanism changed meaning. It was no longer just political. It was hydraulic. But not everyone was pleased. Global water corporations, who had long profited from scarcity, saw their influence shrinking. Quiet legal challenges emerged. Lobbyists called for regulation. Reports framed the movement as environmentally risky, despite scientific data proving sustainability. Burkina Faso stood firm. Every drill site was monitored. Every aquifer mapped. Every community trained. They were not draining the earth. They were learning to live with it. The revolution reached another level when Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and Kenya collaborated to create Africa's first Pan-African water data grid. This system recorded underground water levels, drilling depths, soil stability, and usage patterns. Data was shared freely among African states. This made Africa less dependent on foreign climate modeling, less dependent on external advice, less dependent on imported intelligence. Water had become digital power. In rural villages, people did not think about geopolitics. They thought about life. Clean drinking water. Crops not dying. Cattle surviving. Children staying in school. Mothers not walking for hours. But in global capitals, strategies were being rewritten. What happens when a continent controls its water, its food, and its internal infrastructure? The answer scared many and empowered others. Burkina Faso hosted international visitors. Leaders walked through drilling fields, not as charity guests, but as observers of innovation. The narrative flipped. Africa was no longer just asking. Africa was teaching. The borehole water revolution began to influence global policy discussions. New development models started referencing Burkina Faso instead of Western case studies. UN panels debated how water sovereignty should be respected. But on the ground, there were no debates. Only drills turning. Only pipes flowing. Only children drinking clean water. Only soil turning green. An elderly farmer placed his hands under the flowing water and whispered words that would never be recorded by history books, but would be carried in the hearts of those who heard them. We are no longer begging the sky. We are waking the earth. Burkina Faso had not just drilled water. It had drilled dignity. And through that dignity, it had ignited a Pan-African movement that flowed beneath borders, beyond laws, beyond fear. The revolution was no longer on the surface. It was underground, and it was unstoppable.